A wealthy dynasty rejected the adopted son for years, until a single blood test revealed he was the only true heir to the empire. In our family, resemblance was more than genetics. It was currency. It was proof. It was inheritance already claimed before a single document was signed. The Heir name carried weight in every room it entered. Old estates stretched across the countryside like quiet declarations of power. Towers in the city bore our surname in polished steel. At charity galas, investors leaned in when my father, Jonathan Heir, spoke. His steel-gray eyes steady, his posture carved from generations of certainty. My siblings were reflections of that certainty. My eldest sister carried his fine, aristocratic nose and porcelain complexion. My brother inherited those same piercing gray eyes that made grown men nervous across boardroom tables. Even my younger sister laughed like him, controlled, elegant, assured. And then there was me, 6'3", dark-skinned, broad-shouldered, unmistakably African in features, standing beside them like an annotation someone forgot to remove. At public events, journalists smiled brightly and gestured for the Heir heirs to gather close. My siblings stepped forward effortlessly, forming a portrait of perfect lineage. I followed once, instinctively, only to feel the subtle shift. A pause, a glance, a polite redirection. The frame adjusted. Without me, society columns described us as 3 golden heirs and their enigmatic brother. Enigmatic, a gentle word for misplaced. Whispers traveled easily in rooms filled with crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes. Adopted, surely. A progressive gesture. Jonathan has always been modern. No one corrected them. Not my siblings. Not even my mother. The omission hurt more than accusation. Was I truly a son? Or simply a charitable footnote to a powerful man's story? At home, beneath portraits of pale ancestors glaring down from gilded frames, I felt their eyes linger on me longest. The ancestral hall was a gallery of resemblance. Generation after generation of similar faces, similar bone structure, similar history. I moved through it like an interruption. Yet my father never stared at me the way others did. When guests' eyes flicked between my face and his, searching for explanation, he remained steady, silent, unmoved. It was not affection, he was not a demonstrative man, but it was something firm, something deliberate. My mother wore elegance like armor. She hosted flawlessly, dressed impeccably, and deflected curiosity with charming precision. But sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, I would catch her studying me in the mirror. Not with doubt, with something heavier, something complicated. Why do I look like a stranger in my own family? As a child, I tried to earn belonging. I excelled academically. I spoke carefully. I stood tall. I learned when to remain silent. But intelligence is not resemblance. And in our world, resemblance was everything. The dynasty looked secure in blood, except for me. And in a family built on lineage, being different was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Because when people worship likeness, they mistake appearance for truth. Exclusion in wealthy families is rarely loud. It does not slam doors or raise voices. It rearranges seating charts. It adjusts camera angles. It edits history with a polite smile. At every charity gala, every foundation dinner, every carefully staged family photograph, the pattern repeated itself. My siblings were positioned naturally at my father's side, 1 to his right, 2 to his left, symmetry perfected without effort. I stood slightly behind, not removed, just misplaced, close enough to appear included, far enough to be forgotten. Photographers would call, "The Heir heirs, please." My brother stepped forward with quiet confidence, already fluent in inheritance. My sisters followed, graceful and assured, wearing futures that had been tailored for them since birth. No one told me not to join, but no one made space either. So I learned to hesitate. I learned to wait half a second longer before stepping forward. I learned to smile from the background. I learned that sometimes invisibility is taught, not chosen. At 16, my brother began accompanying our father to property auctions. He walked through marble halls and shook hands with men twice his age. He was introduced as the future of Heir Enterprises. The words fit him like a tailored suit. My eldest sister was invited to private luncheons with influential families. Conversations about alliances disguised as friendships. My younger sister attended charity boards, her laughter echoing our fathers in rooms filled with legacy. And me? I remained home. Private tutors, private study sessions, academic excellence offered as quiet compensation for something no one named aloud. My father insisted on the best education for me. Languages, economics, history of land acquisition, as though intellect might replace resemblance. Was intelligence meant to be my inheritance? At dinners, conversation flowed around succession plans and expansion projects. I listened carefully, memorizing details no one expected me to use. When I offered insight once, thoughtful, measured, the table grew briefly still. Then the topic shifted. Maybe if I prove myself useful, they will see me. But usefulness is not belonging. Even in family portraits displayed across the estate, I noticed a pattern. The lighting favored their features. The framing subtly narrowed when it reached me. It was never intentional enough to accuse, only precise enough to signal. The distance became architectural. They moved through the house like rightful occupants of a story already written. I moved like a footnote someone forgot to erase. And yet, my father never corrected it. He never publicly defended me. He simply watched, steady and unreadable, as though time itself was a witness he trusted more than words. I began to understand. Something quietly painful. Rejection does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply teaches you to step back before anyone asks you to. And when a child learns to shrink to fit the frame, the wound becomes part of his posture. Because the cruelest exclusion is the one that looks like inclusion from a distance. The Heir Foundation's winter banquet was always the crown jewel of our social calendar. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across marble floors. Velvet drapes framed tall windows overlooking the city skyline. A skyline my father had helped shape. Every table shimmered with polished silver and whispered ambition. Power wore perfume that night. Influence smiled behind champagne glasses. And at the center of it all stood the Heir family. We were summoned to the stage after my father's speech. Applause swelled, warm and admiring. Cameras gathered like a second audience. "The heirs, please," a photographer called brightly. My brother stepped forward without hesitation. My sisters followed with practiced grace, positioning themselves naturally beside our father. It was a choreography they had performed since childhood. I moved forward too. Instinct, habit, hope. The photographer lowered his camera slightly and adjusted his tone. "Just the 3 heirs, please." The words were light, casual, practical, but they sliced with precision. For half a second, time stalled. Surely someone would object. Surely one of my siblings would glance back and gesture for me to stay. Surely my father would correct the assumption. They did not. My brother shifted closer to center. My sisters leaned inward. The frame tightened. I felt the silent instruction before anyone spoke it. Step back. So I did. Flashbulbs erupted. Applause rose again. History was captured in bright white bursts. 3 polished heirs and their powerful father. I stood a few feet behind them, close enough to be visible in the shadows, far enough to be edited out later. Was I ever meant to be part of that picture? Maybe I imagined belonging all along. The rest of the evening blurred into polite conversations and careful smiles. Donors shook my siblings' hands with respect already granted. They introduced themselves as future directors, future leaders, future guardians of the estate. No one asked about my future. From across the ballroom, I watched my reflection in a mirrored pillar. Tall, composed enough not to show the fracture forming inside. It was not the photographer's mistake that hurt. It was the silence. Silence from people who shared my table, my roof, my name. In that moment, something irreversible settled into place. I stopped expecting defense. I stopped assuming space would be made for me. I understood clearly and painfully that in the story of our dynasty, I was not a main character. I was an afterthought. When the night ended and the chandeliers dimmed, the official photographs were already circulating online. Headlines praised the unity of the Heir heirs. Comments admired their resemblance. The world saw certainty. I saw absence. And sometimes the deepest humiliation is not being rejected loudly. It is being erased politely. Because when people allow you to disappear from the frame, they are already imagining a future without you in it. The music from the banquet faded behind heavy glass doors as I stepped onto the balcony. Winter air met my face, cold, sharp, honest. Below us, the city shimmered in disciplined rows of light. Towers carrying our name rose into the dark sky like monuments to permanence. Snow drifted down slowly, softening even steel and stone. My father stood alone at the railing. His posture was straight despite the long evening. Hands clasped behind his back. A king surveying land he had conquered without ever raising his voice. For a few moments I said nothing. I simply stood beside him, close enough to feel his presence but not close enough to expect warmth. He did not turn. "Do you know why they stare?" he asked quietly. It was the first time he had acknowledged it aloud. "Yes," I answered, "because I'm not like them." He shook his head once. Slow. Certain. "No," he said, "because they are looking at the wrong measure." The city hummed below us. Somewhere inside the ballroom, laughter rose again. Effortless. Unaware. I waited for him to explain. He did not. That was his way. Jonathan Hale spoke in conclusions, not explanations. His words felt like the final page of a book whose beginning I had never read. "Time reveals blood," he added. The sentence lingered in the cold air between us. Time reveals blood. What did that even mean? Was he defending me? Warning me? Preparing me? Does he know something I don't? For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar. Not belonging, not certainty, but the faint outline of reassurance. He had not corrected the photographer inside. He had not called me forward. But here, away from crystal chandeliers and watching eyes, he spoke to me as though I was not an accident. He turned then, finally meeting my gaze. His gray eyes, the same eyes my siblings wore like inheritance, studied me without discomfort, without question. There was no doubt in them. He stepped closer and placed his hand briefly on my shoulder. The gesture was firm, deliberate, almost protective. It was the first physical reassurance I could remember receiving from him in public or private. It lasted only seconds, but it felt heavier than applause. "They will understand one day," he said softly. "Understand what?" Before I could ask, he withdrew his hand and returned his attention to the skyline. Conversation over. Statement delivered. I stood beside him a little longer, watching snow gather on the balcony railing, feeling both closer to him and more confused than ever inside that ballroom. I had been erased. Out here, under the quiet sky, I had been seen. And though I did not yet understand his words, I carried them with me from that night forward like a sealed envelope I was not ready to open. Because sometimes love does not announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides inside a sentence you will only understand when the world finally forces it to make sense. Empires do not always fall with noise. Sometimes they fold quietly. It was a late autumn afternoon when my father collapsed in his study. No dramatic clutching of his chest. No shouted warnings. One moment he was reviewing land deeds older than most nations. The next, he was on the floor beside his desk, breath shallow, the weight of decades finally claiming its due. The study smelled of leather and old paper when I arrived. Paramedics moved with professional urgency, careful but fast. The man who owned half the skyline was suddenly fragile, dependent on strangers with medical bags and calm voices. By the time we reached the hospital, the machinery of privilege was already in motion. Private corridors were cleared. Specialists were summoned. Administrators spoke in hushed, respectful tones. The Hale name opened doors the way gravity moves tides, effortlessly, without question. Yet beneath the polished efficiency, something else spread. Fear. My siblings gathered in the waiting suite, dressed impeccably as always, but their composure felt rehearsed. My brother spoke quietly into his phone, discussing contingencies with legal counsel. Words like succession and transitional authority slipped through the air as though my father were already a memory. My sisters fielded calls from trustees and investors. Concern masked calculation. Their voices were steady, but their eyes betrayed the question none of them dared to say aloud. What happens to the estate if he does not survive? Is this what legacy reduces us to, numbers and signatures? No one spoke to me directly. I stood slightly apart, watching the choreography of crisis. Even here, even now, the structure remained the same. They formed a circle of assumed authority. I remained just outside it. Hours passed. The hospital lights hummed softly overhead. Nurses moved in and out with controlled expressions. Finally, a senior physician approached, pale and deliberate. "Mr. Hale's heart is severely compromised," he explained. "We are doing everything possible. Everything possible." For a man who had built certainty out of property and contracts, uncertainty now ruled the room. Through a glass partition, I caught a glimpse of him, connected to monitors, oxygen tracing fragile rhythm into the air. The man who once stood unshaken beneath chandeliers now lay diminished by something money could not negotiate. Power had limits, and in that sterile hospital corridor, beneath fluorescent light instead of crystal, I saw my siblings differently. Their resemblance to him, once their greatest security, now seemed fragile, cosmetic, as though likeness alone could not guarantee inheritance. The empire waited, the law waited, time waited, and somewhere beneath the fear and quiet calculation, I felt something else rising. The echo of words spoken years ago on a winter balcony. Time reveals blood. I did not yet understand how, but I sensed that something was about to surface, something no fortune could conceal. Because when mortality enters a dynasty, it tests more than wealth. It tests truth. The doctor entered the waiting suite with the careful posture of a man carrying news that could rearrange a family. His voice was calm, clinical, precise. "Mr. Hale's cardiomyopathy is advanced," he began. "His condition is complicated by a rare hematologic disorder. He will likely require ongoing transfusion support." Medical words filled the room like fog. Prognosis, compatibility, probability. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Your father's blood type is extraordinarily rare. Only close biological relatives are viable donors." Silence followed. Not emotional, but strategic. My brother straightened immediately. "Test all of us," he said crisply. "We're his children." His confidence sounded automatic. Assured. My sisters nodded. Of course they would be compatible. Resemblance had always been their proof. A nurse drew our blood one by one. Vials labeled neatly. Names written clearly. I watched the dark red fill the glass tube from my arm. Steady, unremarkable. Routine. Procedural. Expected. Yet beneath the sterile ritual, tension coiled. What if this is the moment everything shifts? Hours later, the doctor requested a private meeting. We gathered around a polished conference table, our reflections faintly distorted in its surface. 3 familiar faces. One anomaly. He looked at the chart again before speaking. "There appears to be an inconsistency." My brother's jaw tightened. "Inconsistency. Your siblings are not compatible donors." The words seemed to hover, refusing to settle. "That's not possible," my eldest sister whispered. The doctor continued, steady and measured. "We have repeated the tests. Twice." A pause. Then his gaze moved to me. "You are a precise hematologic match for Mr. Hale. In fact, you are the only one." The air left the room in a single invisible breath. I blinked slowly.
"I'm sorry."
"You are the only compatible biological donor." The world did not explode. Tilted. My brother stood abruptly. "Repeat the test again. There must be an error." "There is no error," the doctor replied gently. My younger sister's voice trembled. "But we're his children." The doctor did not respond. He did not need to. For the first time in our lives, resemblance offered no protection. Gray eyes, matching smiles, shared laughter. None of it mattered against cold, measurable truth. Was blood not the measure they had worshipped all along? I looked down at my hands, still marked by the faint imprint of the needle. The same hands that had once stepped back from photographs. The same hands that had never been invited fully into the frame. And now, those hands carried the one thing no one could dispute. His blood answered to mine. Confusion turned to fear across my siblings' faces. Not fear for our father, but fear of implication. I felt no triumph, only clarity. The balcony words returned to me, no longer cryptic. Time reveals blood. And in that hospital room, beneath fluorescent light and medical charts, truth finally stepped forward. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Because when biology speaks, illusion has nowhere left to hide. The word impossible echoed longer than the doctor's explanation. My brother was the first to recover, or at least to attempt recovery. He straightened his jacket, as though posture alone could correct the situation. "There's been a mistake," he said firmly. "Retest. Use another lab." His voice carried the same authority he used in boardrooms. But beneath it, I heard something new. Uncertainty. The doctor remained composed. "The tests have already been repeated. Twice. The results are conclusive." Conclusive. That word did not belong in our family. Nothing was ever final unless my father declared it so. My eldest sister shook her head slowly. "We look exactly like him," she whispered, as if resemblance were evidence enough. And for years it had been. Gray eyes, pale skin, identical smiles in every photograph. Society had praised their likeness as proof of continuity. Investors had trusted the future because it wore a familiar face. Now that same resemblance felt fragile, almost decorative. Was a mirror ever proof of blood? My younger sister's hands trembled as she clutched her phone. "This doesn't change anything," she insisted softly. "We are his children. Legally, perhaps. Emotionally, perhaps. But biologically." The room answered in silence. This is the moment the story shifts, I thought, watching them search for ground that no longer existed. My brother stepped closer to the doctor. "If he needs a donor, we'll find one outside the family. Given the rarity of his blood type," the doctor replied gently, "that will be extremely difficult." The implication hung heavy in the air. Extremely difficult, meaning one option stood in the room. Me. For the first time in our lives, I saw my siblings look at me not with dismissal, but with calculation. Not as the anomaly, but as the variable that could not be ignored. Their world, built carefully on resemblance and assumption, had developed a crack. And cracks spread. Their inherited certainty began to dissolve into questions they had never considered. If they were not compatible, what did that mean? If I was, what did that mean? No one said the word, but it hovered. Bloodline. I felt strangely calm. Not victorious. Not vindicated. Just steady. The years of exclusion had prepared me for standing outside the circle. The difference now was that the circle itself was shrinking. My brother's composure thinned. "We need to speak to father," he said abruptly, as if confirmation from him could restore the architecture, as if truth required permission. Across the corridor, machines beeped steadily. Quiet reminders that this was not only about legacy, but life. And in that sterile hospital space, beneath fluorescent light instead of chandeliers, resemblance finally lost its power. Because when truth arrives, it does not argue. It simply stands and waits for illusion to collapse around it. They wheeled him into the room slowly, carefully, as though even the air around him had become fragile. Machines traced the rhythm of his heart in soft mechanical pulses. The man who once commanded empires with a single glance now lay pale against white sheets, diminished but not defeated. His eyes were closed at first, but when he sensed us, they opened. Sharp, clear, unmistakably present. "Leave us," he said quietly. The authority in his voice, though weakened, still carried weight. My siblings hesitated only a second before stepping back. A lifetime of obedience guided them out the door. And then it was just us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The steady beep of the monitor filled the silence between father and son, A silence that had lasted years. "You know," he said at last. "It was not a question." "I'm the only match," I replied. A faint smile touched his lips. "Yes," I swallowed. The question that had lived inside me since childhood pressed forward. Impossible to hold back any longer. "Am I your son?" His eyes sharpened, not in anger but in certainty. "You are the only one," he said. The words did not explode. They settled, heavy and irreversible. I felt the world rearrange itself quietly around that truth. "But they," I began, "are not my biological children," he finished softly. The machines continued their rhythm, indifferent to revelation. "How?" My voice was barely more than breath. He closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength. "Your mother married me already pregnant," he said. "She told me the child was mine. I chose to believe her." "Chose?" I asked. "Yes." His gaze returned to me. "Because when you were born, there was no doubt. You were not mine by appearance, but you were truth." I struggled to understand. "And the others?" "Conceived during the marriage," he said carefully. "But not with fidelity." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. "So you knew?" I whispered. "Always. All those years, he knew." "Why keep me?" I asked quietly. His expression shifted, almost offended by the phrasing. "Keep you?" he repeated. "You were my son, the only one born of honesty." He reached for my hand. His grip, though weak, was deliberate. "They rejected you for lacking my face," he said. "They never imagined you carried what they did not. Blood." The word did not need to be spoken again. I thought of every photograph, every whisper, every step backward I had taken to make them comfortable. And all along, the truth had been steady beneath it. "Time reveals blood," he murmured, repeating the words from that winter balcony years ago. Now I understood. Not resemblance, not rumor, not assumption. Truth. Tears blurred my vision, but I did not look away. The adopted son, the outsider, the anomaly, the only one who belonged by the measure they had worshipped. And in that quiet hospital room, beneath sterile lights instead of chandeliers, inheritance took on a new meaning. Because sometimes the child they push outside the frame is the only one written into the truth. The lawyer arrived before sunset. His polished shoes clicked softly against the hospital floor, carrying documents that felt heavier than the building itself. My siblings stood on one side of the room, pale and restless. I stood near the window, watching the sky fade from gold to gray. Father insisted on sitting up. His breathing was uneven, but his voice was steady. "Read it," he told the lawyer. The papers rustled. Legal words filled the room. Cold, precise, impossible to argue with. The estate, the properties, the company, every signature, every seal. All assets, the lawyer concluded, belonged to the sole biological and legally recognized heir. Silence followed. My name hung in the air like something sacred and dangerous. My sister's lips trembled. My brother's hands clenched into fists. Their reflections in the glass looked smaller somehow. "This is not fair," one of them whispered. "Fair." The word echoed strangely. For years, fairness had not belonged to me. Father turned his head toward them. "Fairness," he said quietly, "is not decided by resemblance. It is decided by truth." Then his eyes shifted to me. "You owe them nothing," he said. The room tightened around that sentence. It offered permission, even justification. After everything they had done, after every quiet humiliation, every family dinner where I was seated just slightly apart, I could walk away untouched. Was this the moment I was supposed to take my revenge? I felt something stir inside me. Not anger, not triumph. Clarity. If I become cruel now, I prove them right about who they thought I was. A nurse entered quickly. The numbers on the monitor had shifted. Father's condition was unstable again. "We need the transfusion immediately," she said. All eyes turned to me. There it was. The choice. Not about money. Not about inheritance. About blood. I stepped forward without hesitation. Prepare me, I said. My sister gasped softly. After what we? I raised my hand gently to stop her. Not in pride. Not in superiority. In peace. I don't give because I am the heir, I said quietly. I give because he is my father. The nurse guided me down the hall. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The scent of antiseptic filled the air. My sleeve was rolled back, skin cleaned, needle prepared. As the dark red line began to flow through the tube, I watched it steadily. This was the proof they had demanded. Not on paper, not in court, in sacrifice. Back in the room, Father's breathing slowly steadied. The monitor found rhythm again. My siblings stood close to the bed now, not divided, only silent. Inheritance had been decided long before the lawyer arrived. Because true legacy is not about what you claim, it is about what you give. The hospital room was quiet now. Father rested against the pillows, his breathing steadier than before. The transfusion had done what wealth alone could not. The machines no longer sounded urgent, only steady, like a reminder that life had been given another chance. My siblings stood at a distance, no longer arranged by pride or position. The hierarchy that had defined our lives felt smaller in that white room. There were no chandeliers here, no photographers, no quer felicidade frams, only truth. Father turned his head toward me, his eyes softer than I had ever seen them. You gave without hesitation, he said quietly. I simply nodded. There was no need for celebration. The act itself carried its own meaning. For years I had been called the black sheep, the one who did not resemble, the one who did not fit the portrait, the one who stood outside the frame. And yet, in the end, I was the only one who could save him. Was I ever truly outside the family, or only outside their assumptions? My siblings remained silent. Their faces no longer carried confidence built on appearance. The blood test had not just revealed biology, it had revealed how fragile their certainty had been. Father's voice was calm now. Inheritance is not only about property, he said slowly. It is about responsibility. His gaze moved between us. The estate will pass to you legally, he continued, speaking to me. But understand this, what you do with it matters more than owning it. The words felt heavier than any document. Money can be divided. Land can be signed over. But character cannot be transferred. I looked at my siblings, the people who once stood in perfect alignment beside him in photographs. The people who had not known the truth. The people who had lived inside a story carefully constructed for them. There was no anger left in me, only understanding. Their world had cracked when biology spoke. Mine had expanded when truth arrived. I did not feel like a victor. I felt like someone who finally understood his place, not in a picture, but in reality. The black sheep had not been excluded by truth. He had been tested by it, and he had remained steady. As the evening light filtered through the hospital window, I realized something simple and profound. Inheritance is not the name on the deed. It is the values carried in the heart. And in that quiet room, surrounded by truth, I finally felt not adopted, not rejected, but fully seen. Because in the end, the only inheritance that truly lasts is the one built on truth and loyalty.